Hello, my name is Pixel and welcome to the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the Cyberpunk 2077 AMD SMT FIX that has recently been doing the rounds online. If you've got no idea what I'm talking about, there's basically a simple little tweak that can force enable SMT on AMD Ryzen based CPUs. The claims online are that you could see up to a 30% uplift in performance with this tweak applied, though it has to be said there are also plenty of users claiming no uplift whatsoever, and even some that say that they're experiencing substantial drops in performance. Now, I can't deny that this has been an incredibly difficult and often downright frustrating video to put together, not because reaching a conclusion was difficult, but rather due to the messy nature of, well, pretty much everything surrounding it. So with that in mind, before we jump into the meat of this video, I want to quickly establish that yes, the SMT FIX can boost performance on Ryzen processors with 8 or more physical cores, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it will for everybody. And that is why we're going to start things off by taking a look at all the confusion, bad data, and general nuance contained within such a complicated topic. I'll be sure to leave timestamps down in the description so that you can easily jump back and forth between each section, but due to the nature of the beast, I do recommend that you try to watch the entire video from start to finish. With that out of the way, let's dive right into some of this confusion. About a week ago, CD Projekt Red released the 1.05 hotfix that, along with a bunch of general gameplay fixes, also enabled SMT in an official capacity on AMD Ryzen processors with 6 or fewer physical cores. In their patch notes, they state that they had optimized default core/thread utilization on 4-core and 6-core AMD Ryzen processors, 8-core, 12-core and 16-core processors remain unchanged and are behaving as intended. This change was implemented in cooperation with AMD and based on tests from both sides indicating that performance improvements only occur on CPUs with 6 cores and fewer. This statement has led many users to the conclusion that there's either no performance benefits to be had by enabling SMT on CPUs with 8 or more physical cores, or that AMD and CD Projekt Red are mistaken and should have blanket enabled SMT on all Ryzen based processors. The reality, however, isn't quite so clean cut. Changes made directly to the game are going to affect every single user rocking an AMD Ryzen processor, including those that won't really benefit from enabling SMT, and even those that could actually see a reduction in performance with SMT enabled. And that's not to mention that there could also be numerous other influencing factors outside of raw performance which led CDPR to disabling SMT by default. We'll actually look at a couple of these a little bit later on in this video. I'd also like to quickly point out that this sort of multi-threaded funny business is certainly nothing new, it just normally plays out in reverse with developers enabling SMT by default and then savvy users going in and force disabling it in order to increase performance. Whilst we can very easily prove that in this case the statement laid out in the patch notes is not entirely true, at least not in all cases, I do understand why the statement was made and in many ways it does make a lot of sense. At the end of the day, CD Projekt Red and AMD can't account for each and every individual setup, and so they've gone down the path of balance. That's not to say that we won't see SMT being enabled on a wider range of CPUs in later patches, I just assume that both companies would like to do a lot more testing before wandering into that territory. Another point of confusion appears to be based around where you would actually expect to find performance gains when using this tweak. I've watched countless benchmark runs, seen dozens of side-by-side screenshots, and literally read hundreds, if not thousands of comments with users stating that SMT tweak does absolutely nothing, at the same time as being entirely GPU bound. I'm sorry, but this is not how things work. If your performance is being dictated by your graphics card, no amount of extra CPU horsepower is going to increase your frame rate, at least not substantially. Whilst this data is somewhat useful in demonstrating that the tweak really hurts performance, it's completely useless when it comes to measuring the tweak's potential benefits. And things get worse. There appears to be quite a few users out there that made the fatal error of trying to play things safe while testing out this tweak. I would often come across a lot of users that could seemingly demonstrate either big performance gains or losses simply by enabling SMT and while still being completely GPU limited. It took me some time to come up with a reasonable explanation to why this could be happening, but alas, I think I did. On screen now we have a side-by-side of SMT disabled on the left and enabled on the right. As you should be able to see, having SMT enabled here appears to be reducing our frame rate by around 10%, and yet our GPU usage is pegged to the high 90s in both clips, so what gives? Well, actually just the file name. I deduced that in an attempt to either make things easier or to ensure that they've got a backup of the original non-hex edited exe file, a lot of users simply made a copy of the original and then ran one exe for testing SMT and the other for testing SMT off. The 10% performance difference in this case appears to be entirely down to GPU driver optimization, as our GPU drivers are looking for specific .exe file names when applying their optimizations. By simply running the same test again, but this time with both SMT ON and OFF running from the Cyberpunk 2077.exe, you can see that performance is practically identical between the two runs. This is a prime example of why you always need to be very careful when referring to data posted by random users online. Don't get me wrong, we encourage people to go out and test stuff and even share the results, it's just, in doing so we inevitably create an awful lot of bad data that then needs to be sifted through and validated. But moving on, the last bit of confusion that we'd like to try and tackle is what actually constitutes a CPU bottleneck, and more importantly, how do we identify it? I think the most widely accepted definition is that you are CPU bottlenecked when your performance is primarily limited by your CPU. The problem is, CPUs are incredibly complex, and there's many ways that a CPU could limit performance outside of simply being thread-bound. For this reason, we generally just point to our GPU utilization as the primary identifier of a CPU bottleneck. Providing that you're not artificially limiting your frame rates, you would expect to see your GPU utilization percentages to be up in the high 90s whilst GPU bound, with that number dropping when another component becomes a limiting factor, with the CPU normally being the prime suspect. Unfortunately though, from time to time we do come across instances where a drop in GPU utilization doesn't necessarily mean that we are being CPU limited. For instance, Cyberpunk 2077 currently has an issue which can cause performance to slowly degrade during play. I've not been able to pinpoint exactly why this happens, but it does happen reliably and is highly repeatable. For example, early in the game there is a gig that sends you to assassinate a guy living above a bar. When we start the mission, our GPU utilization is up in the high 90s as expected, but as the mission is carried out and things start to get hectic, we slowly see our GPU utilization drop. After around 10 minutes we're down in the low 90s, after 20 minutes it's basically dropping as low as the mid 80s, and by the 30-minute mark it's basically all over the place. Where things get super interesting, however, is when you start to notice that alongside our drop in GPU utilization, we also see a small but measurable drop in CPU utilization. This indicates that it's very unlikely that these drops are caused by becoming thread-bound, and since we can very easily recreate this issue, we can also test and see that this behaviour appears to happen regardless of whether or not SMT is enabled. The icing on the cake is that simply leaving the area or reloading the save does not appear to solve this problem, and so the only way we know how to reset performance after this happens is to completely close and relaunch the game. Knowing this, it's also reasonable to assume that some users have likely unknowingly closed the game frustrated with their performance, gone searching for a fix online, found the SMT tweak, enabled it, rebooted the game, and instantly been able to tell the difference. They'd unsurprisingly attribute the huge performance gains to said tweak, when in reality it was most likely due to them simply restarting the game. It's these sorts of inconsistencies that can cause potential tweaks to spread like wildfire throughout a community, along with plenty of that bad information that we've been talking about. If you would like another perspective on these sorts of issues, I would recommend that you check out a recent video on this very topic from Steve over at Gamers Nexus. While Steve's conclusion does somewhat differ from my own, Gamers Nexus do a great job of explaining the various issues that benchmarkers face when trying to capture meaningful data. I'm also fairly sure that had they been able to perform their benchmarks in the more densely populated areas of the game like I have, that they would have most likely come to a similar conclusion to the one that I did. For anyone that's interested, I will leave a link to their video down in the description below, but for now though, let's finally get onto the performance of SMT ON versus SMT OFF. All the footage that you're about to see has been recorded on our Sapphire Nitro Plus RX 6800 XT graphics card alongside the Ryzen 7 5800X CPU. We played the game at a 1440p resolution and used a mixture of high and ultra graphical settings. Whilst the benefits of SMT would be much easier to demonstrate at lower settings, I thought that it would be best to prove that the benefits still exist across more reasonable setups. I also want to make it clear that this is to demonstrate that it is possible to see performance gains on a Ryzen processor with more than 8 physical cores, but that should not be taken as any form of guarantee that you will see performance gains on your own personal setup. Our Nitro Plus RX 6800 XT is an extremely powerful graphics card, and likely one of the only reasons that we are still able to hit CPU bounds at these settings, so please do keep that in mind when deciding whether or not you want to try enabling SMT for yourself. Right, so let's start out by trying to ensure that we're not likely going to see a drop in performance when SMT is enabled whilst being GPU bound. This was probably the one thing that I focused on more than any other, not because a slight reduction in peak performance would have necessarily been a big problem, but rather because if there was a reduction in performance, we'd like you to know about it. The last thing that we would want is a bunch of users giving this tweak a go, noticing a small reduction in their averages, so thinking that SMT is bad, and disabling it before they were able to see the true benefits. Thankfully, however, on my setup, I was unable to find any measurable reductions in performance whilst GPU bound during regular play. I did dozens of side-by-side comparisons, a decent number of longer benchmark runs, and tested across a wide range of stress points and found absolutely nothing that would indicate a downside in raw performance. Even during the most variable of intense combat benchmarks, we found performance to be almost identical. SMT enabled did always come out just on top, but not with enough of a lead to put it completely outside of the realm of run-to-run variance. If you're wondering why our CPU usage is substantially higher with SMT enabled without producing substantially more frames, that is simply because SMT is not free and so the CPU is required to do more work in order to produce the same amount of performance. This is normal and why it is possible that some users could potentially see some performance degradation with SMT enabled. But anyway, now that we've established that our performance whilst GPU bound, at least on this system, is pretty much identical, let's start hunting for those substantial 30% plus gains. Unsurprisingly, due to our relatively high settings, we're not going to find them everywhere, but they do exist. I found that in particular Japantown and the city centre are by far the biggest culprits when it comes to taxing our CPU. There's certainly a lot of other areas around the city where we found our system bound by the CPU, but generally these only cover a small area or a very specific viewpoint. Japantown and the city centre, however, are fairly sizable, and so we can find ourselves CPU bottlenecked for prolonged periods of time, especially when we find ourselves completing missions in performance heavy areas. It goes without saying that it's at these points that we see the biggest uplift from enabling SMT, with SMT often being the difference between dropping below 60 FPS and sticking well above 70. With that said, it's also worth pointing out that even Japantown and the city centre don't always leave us CPU bound. This is because the time of day makes a massive difference to the density of NPCs and traffic. For instance, this shot overlooking Japantown shows a huge 30% uplift in performance from enabling SMT, but when we change the time of day to a time where we've got less people on the streets, that 30% difference melts away to nothingness. Truth be told, I could very easily produce dozens of side-by-side shots showing much higher frame rates with SMT enabled, but the real difference is something that has to be felt rather than seen, especially when we consider that the vast majority of the time there's not really going to be a measurable difference in raw performance whatsoever. During normal play, we find our frame rate mostly sticking between around 80 and 110 frames per second, and on our FreeSync enabled monitor that honestly feels great. Having SMT enabled, whilst unlikely to affect our peak performance, can have a substantial effect on our lows, and believe me when I say in certain areas of Night City, that difference is going to be very noticeable indeed. Now, before moving on and talking about a few of the little oddities that I've noticed between having SMT on and off, I'd like to quickly bring up something that I've unfortunately been unable to measure, but I am at least fairly confident about, and that is the performance impact of simply turning the camera. Again, this is not something that's going to apply all of the time, but it can sometimes. When turning the camera, the game is constantly spawning in and out assets as they come into view, and this can be very heavy on our CPU, and so, at times, mouse input can feel rather sloppy. This can be seen in the footage on screen now. If you look at the frame rate graph, you should be able to see that as we swipe from left to right, performance dips and then comes straight back up again as soon as that movement stops. This can be incredibly distracting. At times you'll be at, let's say, around 90 FPS, but then you'll flick the camera left or right, and then for a fraction of a second, your frame rate will dip right down into the mid 60s before coming straight back up again. Unfortunately, enabling SMT does not fix this behaviour, but I do believe that it at least reduces it. This could tie into something that we'll take a look at shortly, but for now, I just wanted to bring this up just in case any of you have been struggling like I have with the sloppy mouse input when turning. On a side note, if you really want to eliminate these dips whilst turning, I seriously recommend that you try capping your frame rate to a number that you can easily achieve, as this will minimize any frame time variance. Okay, so now that we've gone over all the confusion and proved that on a Ryzen 7 5800X there are some fairly measurable performance benefits to be had by enabling SMT, I think that it's now time that we take a look into a few of the oddities that I noticed during my many hours of testing. The first thing that I noticed almost instantly when enabling SMT is that the third person driving camera was much smoother. Basically, when you start brushing up against CPU limits with SMT disabled, the camera can become incredibly stuttery to the point where I would often default to first person driving just to avoid it. To be fair, I'm not even sure that I'm really talking about stutter. The camera would quite literally jump from one point to the next, seemingly adding inputs and not removing them like what you would expect with traditional stutter. It's also worth mentioning that this has got nothing to do with our frame rate, as our FPS remains stable while this happens. In my opinion, this is without a doubt an issue with how input is handled, specifically with driving in third person. One not so positive change that I noticed was the increased presence of certain visual bugs. Now, I can't actually prove that these were caused by SMT, as they do appear whilst SMT is disabled, but the frequency in which they appeared whilst SMT was enabled did appear to be much higher. The most common, though thankfully still not very common, was the famous naked T-pose whilst driving. Again, this only seems to happen when driving through very demanding areas, but it is something to keep in mind. Another bug that I experienced was having the ability to drive through other cars. So far, this has only happened to me 3 times in over 100 hours of gameplay, but each time that it did happen, I did have SMT enabled. This could be purely coincidence, but I just want to let you know in case it's not. And finally, the very last thing that I want to mention is something that could quite possibly be entirely placebo, and that is that I think that enabling SMT may be ever so slightly increasing input latency. Honestly, I could be completely wrong about this. I've unfortunately got no way of doing proper testing. I think that I can feel a difference. By all means, I could just be confusing extra smoothness with latency. I don't think I am, but it's certainly a possibility. If anything, I would assume that any additional latency is probably caused by simply increasing our CPU's headroom, allowing it to stay further ahead of our graphics card rather than it being a hard-coded increase. One thing that I do know for certain is that the Red engine is actually capable of very low latency, especially when running with a capped frame rate. I bring this up because it kind of demonstrates a lot of potential variability when it comes to input latency in general. With that said, if I am right and there is a little additional input lag, it's certainly not to a level that I'm personally worried about. Again, I just want to put all my cards on the table, but then what you do with them is entirely up to you. For now though, that is all my talking points covered, so in conclusion, if you are running a Ryzen based CPU that has got 8 or more physical cores, you could indeed see a performance benefit from tweaking the game to force enable the usage of SMT. However, in order to see these benefits, you must be both thread bound and still have enough GPU headroom for your CPU to saturate. It's also important that you understand that certain setups could in fact see some performance degradation, and so it's paramount that you benchmark the game in order to ensure that you're not simply throwing away any performance. If you do decide to give enabling SMT a try, I personally recommend that you do it via the Cyber Engine Tweaks plugin that's available over on GitHub. I'll leave a link down in the description. The reason why I'm not going to demonstrate the install process in this video is simply because as the plugin is updated, so are the instructions, and I really don't want to cause any more confusion than I likely already have. But yeah, I think that's it. I think we are finally done. Congratulations in reaching the end of this video. If you're still here, it's obvious that we've been through an awful lot together today, so how about slapping that subscribe button and ringing that bell so that you'll be notified when we upload new content. If you like this video, then please do like the video, and if you've got any questions, suggestions or feedback, you can leave them in the form of a comment down below. For now though, I have been Pixel, and from myself and everybody here at the Sapphire Tech YouTube channel, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, we'll catch you later. Bye bye. This was a hard video.